I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Every week, I talk to writers who interest me, excite me, or surprise me. Writers who have big books and even bigger ideas. Today on the show, I'm joined by David Huebert to chat about his new novel, Oil People. Even though I've been living in Toronto for 9 years now, I grew up in Halifax, and Nova Scotia always occupies prime real estate in my mind. So whenever I get the chance to read work by writers who are also from the East Coast, I'm always all in and super excited to do it. This is what brought me to Ducks by Kate Beaton, which I championed on Canada Reads last year. And this week, I'm proud to sing the praises of another East Coast author, David Huebert. David is from Halifax, like me, and he's fascinated by nature and our relationship to it. David's novel is called Oil People, and it's about a family in southwestern Ontario with deep connections to the oil industry in the region. But it's not just about that. It's also about how oil is embedded in the fabric of Canada itself and what that means for everyone who lives in this country. So to get into all of this, David joined me in the CBC studios in Toronto. Hey, how's it going?
Hey Mattea. Thanks so much for having me. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Oil People is set in southwestern Ontario, and I want to dive into the setting of that a little bit. But first off, I want to ask about where you're actually from, because like me, you're from Halifax and have these deep connections with the East Coast, which is where a lot of your other previous published work has been set. Mm-hmm. What's your connection to place when it comes to writing and thinking about literature in general?
I am from Halifax, Huebert. That deeply informed my first book of fiction, Peninsula Sinking. I'm definitely someone that is very, very immersed in geography, geology, ecology. So that's sort of like my go-to metaphorical instinct, I guess I would say. So I moved to southwestern Ontario in 2013 to do a PhD at Western University. And yeah, I started looking around the area, and I was like, oh, there's a town called Petrolia over there. Oh, there's a town called Oil Springs over here. And that just sort of piqued my interest. This history of oil seemed to me very literally and metaphorically buried. And that in itself fascinated me. And the more I kept looking for oil in the region of southwestern Ontario, the more I found myself just totally like my writer's brain just totally active, buzzing.
When I was reading Oil People, I felt it was almost a part of this lineage of writers from the Maritimes who have also very deep connections with places outside the Maritimes and sort of being rooted in that sense of heritage, but then also being really attuned to just the physical surroundings of whatever these other places are that they go to move, often for work, often working in extractive industries. Like I was thinking a lot about Alistair MacLeod when I was reading Oil People, thinking about the fact that he worked as a young man in like mining in Ontario, and I think also up in the north. But then he had these stories as well that were super rooted in Cape Breton, talking about like fishermen, coal miners there. That was really on my mind. So it's interesting to hear you talk about that it was something that it seems like you were really tuned into when you were writing. So you mentioned Oil People is set in southwestern Ontario, and you were talking about this sort of hidden history of the oil boom there. And I literally learned about the fact that there was ever oil in southwestern Ontario from reading your book. I had never heard of it before, which is super different to the way that oil is talked about, for instance, in Alberta, where it's like the main narrative or one of the main narratives that they have about the creation of their province and what it means to be an Albertan. How did you learn about the history of oil in the region? I know you were living in the region, but what was the process of actually being like, I want to dig into this?
It would be hard for me to pin down a specific moment, but it was definitely just driving around, getting to know people in the area, learning about these place names. So in 2017, I went to Sarnia. I had developed a friendship with a couple from Sarnia. And if you go to Sarnia and you're from Nova Scotia, and maybe that's part of like what you're talking about as well, is like seeing this new place with a particular type of eye. Like part of me, there is a judgment of industrialism at work and thinking around this stuff, but there's also just like a curiosity and a wonder that I try to cultivate sort of in all my thinking. So when I went to Sarnia, that sort of muscle was flexing, or that neural network was really tingling because there's 62 petrochemical refineries on both sides of the river, right? So it's this, if you've ever been there and you're not from there, it's this amazing, crazy industrial world and landscape, like totally altered landscape. And it's all sort of in the service of oil refining. So I was like, oh, there are all these oil refineries here. That's curious. That's strange. That's amazing. Weirdly beautiful, like especially at night. And then I'm also naturally someone that just thinks, well, where did that come from? And then I started to look into that history. And then I found myself landing eventually at the Oil Museum of Canada and the Fairbank oil fields. And just, if you're interested at all in this history, those are the places that you have to go. Once you start to learn about the history, it's pretty wild.
Well, yeah, I mean, the history of oil is a big part of what's in the book, right? There's these two strands of story that we see. So there's one that's taking place kind of not contemporary times for us, but closer to our time in 1987, and then a story that's taking place in 1862 at the beginning of this oil boom in southwestern Ontario. We have this character, Jade, who's the teen protagonist in 1987 in Oil People, and oil is like her whole world, right? Her family is steeped in it. But there's also a heavy mental and physical cost, I think, for her being in that environment. How is she navigating all of that as a teen girl who's also coming of age and dealing with all that involves?
Yeah, that's a good question. She's navigating it with great difficulty, I would say. She's navigating it with intelligence, I would also say, and poise and curiosity. You know, like many people at 13, she's trying to fit in. She's trying to find her own place. Jade, this central character whose name I love because it shouts out to both a rock and a plant, which is very much exactly what we have in oil, right? She also has this older sister, Angie. And so a lot of the concerns about landscape, about oil, about politics, history, all the uglier side gets filtered to Jade through her older sister, Angie. So she's trying to figure that out, navigate all that, figure out how she feels about all of that because her sister is quite radical and really rebelling against her parents. And she also is trying to achieve acceptance by her parents. Her parents are also in conflict over the land. Hence the escalation of the novel, I guess, is the difficulty of trying to deal with all these things and the difficulty, I think, of trying to just like live a normal, quote-unquote normal teenage existence, whatever that might look like, with all this added pressure of petroculture, petrohistory, and, as you mentioned, the actual environmental impact of oil on her body.
Yeah, that's a lot to deal with for a teenager. I want to talk about, though, the older portion of the book, the 1862 heritage, like what Jade is kind of reckoning with. We have this story of Clyde, Jade's ancestor, who had this like vision of developing oil wells in this territory in southwestern Ontario. How did that pursuit affect his life? What do we learn about Clyde in this novel?
We learn that he's a troubled man, I would say, that he's driven by a desire to become rich, and he's driven by a deep ambition. Clyde's sort of also affected in deep ways by the substance itself and the materiality of oil, what it means to live in this region. This whole question of like settler colonialism, petrocolonialism, that's very much at the heart of this history, I think is also part of what's corrupting Clyde, if you know what I mean, in terms of his own relationship to this landscape. He definitely goes wrong. And like, as we see, history goes on, and many generations have to live with the consequences of his decisions, which were clearly problematic decisions. But at the same time, him personally is also very caught up in historical forces that are beyond his control.
I found the connection between Clyde's story and the way that you tell that with Jade's story that's taking place in 1987 and the way that they're sort of influenced by each other. It's not just that Jade is influenced by her history, but Clyde is influenced by almost these like premonitions of the future. What inspired you to weave together the narratives like that? I thought it was so cool.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you appreciated that because it was a really important part of structuring this novel. The underlying theoretical rationale for the way these two, the 1862 seam and the 1987 seam, bounce off each other is the way that oil affects temporal thinking and temporal life. So oil as material substance, hundreds of millions of years old life that we're now bringing back and using, right? And burning in our tailpipes, drilling up, radically altering the biosphere that we're now living in, right, with this substance. So, and also like on a daily level, I couldn't make. Well, actually, I rode a bike over here, but often it would be the case that I couldn't have, but I also traveled in the air from Halifax to get here. So I couldn't have done that without oil, right? That totally affects the ability to travel through air, the ability to travel by car. Using fossil fuels has totally affected how human beings see time. So for me, oil like makes us temporally crazy in certain ways. We're like temporally deranged. And so, yeah, I wanted to express that. And I was also sort of just wondering like, oil, it's a bit magical, right? It's a bit weird. It's there bubbling up in the swamp underneath them. So there's something a bit fantastical. So part of that weirdness, part of that fantastical narrative juice is what I wanted to feed into that sort of relationship between 1862 and 1987.
Well, and oil also felt to me like a character in the novel in a way. It's like one of those things, if someone had sat me down and asked me, Mattea, is oil an organic substance? I would have thought about it and been like, yes. But I think that because oil, in the way that I interact with it, is I, rent a car for the weekend to go to the cottage and I'm fueling up the car. Yeah. I know that it's used to make plastics and all sorts of manufactured goods that I use in my day-to-day life. I fly home to see my mom and the plane uses fuel, but I'm not involved in that extractive process, right? And so the fact that it is organic matter, that it used to be plants and fossils and all of these things is not part of how I interact with it. But it's a living thing in the book almost, right? It has a personality of its own. It is like this magical substance. And thinking about the themes in this book and in your other work, these issues are clearly top of mind for you. How did you get so into thinking about this?
So oil continues to fascinate me, obviously. I think it's a substance that we don't think enough about, really. So even the narrative that you gave, where you like put the gas in the car, et cetera, like, isn't it weird that we don't see the gas that we put in the car? And isn't that part of the whole trickery of the petroleum industry? That one of the things that is fascinating that like scholars in the field of the energy humanities have remarked on is oil's invisibility, right? So it's there circulating through all our lives all the time. So I just wanted to hold on to that weirdness. I just wanted to sort of think as deeply as I could about this substance. It's rethinking what oil is and rethinking also our relationship to oil. And for me, it's a huge part of what I want to help people see. And part of that means just like looking at it and understanding it and facing it and confronting it, which I don't think we do enough of.
I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. I'm talking to Canadian writer David Huebert about his novel Oil People. You attended Western University in southwestern Ontario. You did a PhD in environmental humanities, and you've described yourself as a dirty nature writer, which I definitely felt was an accurate description of the work in your book. What do you mean by dirty nature writer? Is that sort of setting yourself in opposition to a certain other kind of nature writing?
Absolutely it is. Not like a hostile opposition at all, but I think we've sort of moved to a place in the conversation where traditional form of nature writing has become obsolete. I will say as well, so dirty nature writing is a term that I developed with my good friend Tom Cull, who's a poet who teaches at Western University, who works for the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority. I developed that with him, but it was actually coined by two scholars, Carolyn Schauman and Heather I. Sullivan. So I just wanted to give them a shout out. But I do think they were articulating something that was very much already in the zeitgeist, if you know what I mean. So Bill McKibben in the 1980s wrote a book called The End of Nature. So he was saying already in the 1980s that the idea of nature was obsolete, right? Because if you look at, fossil fuel emissions, if you look at microplastics, there's no substance on Earth anymore that's not affected by human activity, right? And so the idea of capital N nature, as developed by sort of many romantic poets in the 19th century, in the thinking of Ralph Waldo Emerson or Henry Thoreau, the idea basically is like nature's over there, civilization's over here. Nature's a thing we go into to sort of find ourselves, explore, refresh, and then we come back to civilization, and that's where human activity takes place. So it's partly also a distinction between human and the wilderness, or human and non-human animals. I think that's a bit problematic. I think that's troublesome. I think those are binaries that are still sort of deeply entrenched in us. For example, like truck commercials are a really good example of that. So you're watching the Stanley Cup playoffs, which when you watch the Stanley Cup playoffs, it's like at least 110% truck commercials, which is wild. And the trucks always go into the wilderness. That's where they go. So you need a big giant truck to burn a whole bunch of oil to go into wilderness. And then they're all alone. These usually like dudes, burly dudes in trucks. They're all alone in the wilderness, and they're like an eagle soaring right by the window of the truck. So that's like a fantasy of nature that I find troublesome, that I want to unthink. And like I want to try to unpack and problematize the distinction between human and non-human life, between nature and whatever, civilization and not nature. And I think my fiction sort of prods us in that direction, even while it's really important for me also to not be didactic or sermonizing in my fiction. So I hope I managed to get that some of that come across just by like through curiosity and wonder and characters genuinely exploring their own experiences.
Oil People, for me, as I was reading it, it captures this like frontier sense of spirit and this colonial expansion that was a huge feature of North American life in the 1860s when Clyde's story takes place. When it comes to this early history of oil in North America, there is this manifest destiny type vibe to it of like, we need to extract from the land, we need to develop the land, as though the land wasn't already being developed and cultivated by the people who were there before. What did you want to explore there? And I guess, is there any commentary in that about the present day push to continue extracting from the land in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really important part of me thinking through how to explore the history of petrocolonialism and petroculture in the region. I've been to Sarnia, like I mentioned. I'd been, in 2017, I took part in Aamjiwnaang Solidarity Against Pipelines, Toxic Tour, what they call. And I had my actually little baby, Rose, was there with me. She was 3 months or something. And we walked through the toxic tour of Aamjiwnaang. So Aamjiwnaang is this community in the middle of Lambton County. Yeah, it's a First Nation that's gradually been shrunken in a familiar story, right? So the injustices that have been done to the people of Aamjiwnaang were very much one of the places where my head was at when thinking about what oil has done wrong and what mistakes have been made and how sort of petroleum has been linked to other settler colonial projects. Yeah, so that was always very top of mind for me and something I wanted to explore directly or indirectly, or in a way that obviously I knew that that wasn't my story to tell, but I still wanted to make sure that I encountered it in certain ways in the novel. So I took more of a settler perspective, and I made sure that that was very much there in like some of the secondary characters' perspectives. Regarding the question about oil and the sort of contemporary political message, like I do think bringing attention to the community of Aamjiwnaang and their current struggles, like it's, as I see it, the important political story that's adjacent to this book, or that this book might bring to light, is like there are ongoing land claims there. There are huge health issues being experienced by people there. So yeah, I would say that's just what I would add and what I think it's important to say regarding like this book's place in community.
I think it's interesting that you said earlier you're trying to not be didactic in your fiction and just sort of present maybe a story of things as they are. What do you feel the role of fiction is in thinking about some of these questions, maybe of, you know, right and wrong and sort of the good and evil? I feel like you said you had a goal to present these characters as complex, and to have even Clyde, who's engaged in this sort of like problematic pursuit, have things about him that made him sympathetic. Yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yeah, this whole question of good and evil is really fascinating to me, and something that I'm thinking a lot about, and something that I'm still trying to articulate. But I do think oil is often a politically bifurcating issue, right? And an issue that a lot of people carry a lot of tension. There's tons of activism around oil, around pipelines, people that want to defend their own right to drive trucks. The activism that's being done is really crucial work, like anti-pipeline protests complex and everything. But at the same time, I think that part of what I'm interested in is the way in which all people, all contemporary people to a certain extent, varying extents obviously, but are implicated in oil culture and in the materiality of oil. And I think that calls into question somewhat this whole question of, or at least complicates the question of good and evil and the question of right and wrong. So it opens up spaces of ambiguity. And those are really important for me to allow fiction to try to explore. And also like a huge element of this is people just trying to live their lives and people that are not necessarily that well off, trying to feed their families and people just trying to get by. And because I write a lot about industry, and that's one of the things that I was always interested in when writing about the oil industry was like not trying to vilify people who are just laborers in the oil industry. And I think as soon as you take oil as sort of the overarching landscape or setting that you're going to work within, and then you take people and you give them struggles that are connected to oil, but oil's not their main opposition, right? They also have complex, overlapping struggles in their lives. That's when I think you start to get like more powerfully human dilemmas and problems, such as what I'm trying to articulate with Jade and her family members.
Do you feel in the process of writing this book that you have learned anything or changed your perspective about the role of fiction in truth-telling? Because I felt when reading Oil People, I felt a bit like a mirror was being held up maybe to some of the parts of our society, the nation state that we live in, that we sort of like to gloss over.
I want to hold up a mirror.
Yeah.
That's something that I think good fiction often does. I think the particular mirror that I want to hold up is like a distorted environmental mirror. Maybe it's like a convex mirror, and it's a little bit radiant as well, and it's got some beautiful colors in it. And it, I mean, one of the things I've definitely learned along the journey is like, how can you be critical, but how can you also make space for wonder and joy? And that's something that I always have to come back to and try to remind myself and to make the story live in its own way. So that's one of the things I think that you have to keep in mind when writing about this kind of thing is like, where's the joy? I hesitate around the word hope in some of these conversations, and I'm not sure it's the best word all the time, but there needs to be some levity, I guess is where I would settle in. There needs to be some sort of positive affect. And I think that's an important piece to give you some balance and to give your readers some space.
David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Mattea.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was David Huebert. He joined me in studio in Toronto. David Huebert won the CBC Short Story Prize back in 2016 for his story Enigma. And that story later made its way into David's first short story collection that got published, Peninsula Sinking. Submissions for the 2025 CBC Short Story Prize are now open. You could win $6,000 from the Canada Council for the Arts, a writing residency at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, and have your work published on CBC Books. Just head to cbcbooks.ca for all the details. This week's show was produced by Ryan B. Patrick and our executive producer, Aaron Balser. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk. I also want to thank our tech, Laura Antonelli, and the entire CBC Books team for making this show happen every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and you've been listening to Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.